So first of all, the value proposition. So let's assume we have a discovery and it solves a problem. How do we determine the value that solution's bringing? And really the value that solution is bringing is dependent upon its incremental benefits over what's already out there. And so usually the first three questions I ask are what is the problem? What's the solution? Hopefully that's your discovery technology. And how is it better, faster, or cheaper than what's currently being done out there? And you all have the notes to these slides that kind of give a list of some of these examples. So better, that could be more efficacious. It's a better standard of care. It could be less toxic. It could also be easier. That's another sort of version of better in terms of maybe it's easier to comply with the treatment, easier to take, easier information to digest. Faster, that could mean the patient gets better faster. Maybe you have results or information if it's a diagnostic. Maybe you have those results. You get that information faster and can act on it faster. And then cheaper. Cheaper is fairly self-explanatory, but it could mean cheaper to the customer, right? It could be cheaper to produce, and that's that's essentially cheaper. So let's talk about an example value proposition. So colon cancer research. Let's assume the state of the art here is colonoscopy and biopsy. And the discovery that we have is this potential diagnostic here where we have 51 serum proteins that are overexpressed in a mouse model, human homologs confirmed, and all are known serum proteins. So the question here is, what is the value of this discovery? Anyone want to take a stab at that?
Some kind of diagnostic.
Right. So that's sort of the solution, right? That's the discovery. How is it better, faster, or cheaper?
In this particular case may not be, but in terms of diagnosis, if immediately assay is available, it could, allows the sample to be tested, patient confirm whether he has cancer or not cancer.
Right. Okay, so maybe a result of having, let's say, a blood diagnostic for something like this is that it's better in terms of maybe it's less invasive. That could be one option. Maybe this could also be faster. Actually, maybe it's also it takes time to do the procedure, and the blood test could be faster.
Also, this could be better predictive than existing.
Sure.
Markers.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. And then maybe, so sometimes you have one or you have all of them or a combination of them. So you could, it's very possible that this test could result in faster diagnosis, more specific diagnosis or more accurate diagnosis. So I like where this activity was placed in the presentation because a few of you sort of foreshadowed kind of the next piece of what we're going to talk about here, which is there's kind of two aspects to this analysis. You kind of look internally at what you have, the technology that you've invented. What do I have? And then you sort of look externally and you say, who wants this, right? Who's willing to purchase this? And so that's the market piece. So we've kind of thought through how do we analyze what our value proposition is. The next step is really to look at the market, right? So who wants this solution now? Who's the customer that just has such a pent-up need for this that they'll say, if you said what if I could give you this solution now? They would say I'd place an order for 1 million of them or whatever. They'd hand you the money in their pocket, or the insurer would hand you the money in their pocket in order to get that solution. And so characterizing who that person is and sort of how big that market is of course a big step in working up towards the ultimate commercialization strategy. So, the first step in that is identifying who that person is, who that patient is, who the customer is, who the end user is, which is sometimes different than the customer, and thinking about how the discovery you have will be delivered to that customer. right? And so sometimes it's obvious, but in many cases it's less obvious, you know. So I have this science, this great discovery. What will the package look like that is ultimately delivered to that customer, right? So is it a pill in the bottle? Is it some sort of a service maybe? You know, is this just one component to an overall solution, or is it more of like a standalone solution? And then, you know, something that's often just as important, you know, in developing countries, for instance, is how does that solution get to the customer? How is it being delivered? And, you know, what are the mechanisms involved in doing that? So once we've kind of characterized that, once we understand who the players are and have kind of set the stage, then we can spend time researching that, right? We can figure out who the players are, do some market research. So I like to think of market research as kind of two sort of sources for that. One is your static market research, you know, Google market research reports and things like that. The place, though, where I think you can get the most benefit, the most bang for your buck, if you will, is in talking to key opinion leaders or domain experts, right? And so, you know, once you understand sort of what that product looks like and who the customer looks like, then you can spend some time kind of socializing your idea, meeting people who are in that space, leveraging your network, you know, LinkedIn and things like that to talk to people. You know, obviously the first question that comes to mind is how big is that market? Again, sometimes that's obvious depending upon the type of technology. You know, you don't really have to do a whole lot of research if you have a diabetes therapeutic or a cancer therapeutic or something like that. Maybe there's less market risk there. But in other instances, maybe you do. You know, maybe it's an orphan population, or maybe it's not clear what the addressable market is within that big. You know, you first have this big number, right, which is kind of the total market. And then you sort of try to peel the onion, as they say, and look at what the addressable market is in there. In your example, you know, you had 80% who
potentially could benefit.
Right. And so you might have a bigger number. It's much more precise and less naive to say, okay, well, it's not that bigger number, but there's 80% within this big number that are the people who we're targeting, and these are the reasons why. And so, you know, there are other aspects to that. So maybe you have a sense for what ballpark you're playing in terms of how big is the overall market and what's the addressable market inside of there. And then, of course, that can be sort of affected by whether it's kind of a new market, whether it's growing, how crowded the market is, things like that. And then in doing this kind of research, one of the things that I like to sort of challenge myself and other people with is, I think our nature is sort of to look for information that validates our idea, that sort of supports our idea and reinforces our idea. I think another approach that can be helpful is to go out looking for things that might kill it, that could be kind of critical failures. Right, and so what would get in the way? I mean, I tend to be an optimistic person, right? But I think it's important to understand what the weaknesses are, and go seek those out so that you can understand and kind of quantify the level of those risks to commercialization. And so examples of those kinds of risks or barriers to adoption would be related products in use. So said another way, you know, competition. Who is your competition? You know, how crowded is that space? Obviously, there's regulatory concerns, so understanding that pathway and understanding, you know, what path you'll have to go and sort of what the risks are associated with that are important. Ease of implementation, you know, does this disrupt an existing workflow? Would there be a lot of training associated with this, with the new product? You know, you have to convince decision makers, so maybe you have some strong scientific data, but for whatever reason, maybe that goes against accepted practices within the industry and entrenched players. And then, of course, blocking IP, right? So we want to get our own IP estate, but there could be other people who have IP out there, and that IP could be blocking us in certain ways. And so this is just a little example. I mean, really have to go through this in detail, but there can be instances where you may have some sort of value proposition, and it may not be clear that that value proposition is really enough to kind of unseat existing players or the existing solution, right? So, is your incremental benefit enough to really justify the investment that's going to go into bringing a completely new solution to market, right? So maybe you have something that's better, maybe it's a lot better. Maybe you have an imaging solution that's resolution is 100 times greater, but what the market has for that application is already sufficient, and they're really just looking for cost reductions. And so, in that case, it's great technology, great science, but maybe that's not the right market or the right application for the technology.